Bank manager humiliates Keanu Reeves only to find out he owns the bank. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. March 15th, 2022 will forever be etched in the minds of everyone who witnessed what happened at the Midtown Financial Bank in downtown Los Angeles. The air was thick with tension, and all eyes were on a man in a black leather jacket, his hands in his pockets, his face calm yet unreadable. That man was none other than Keanu Reeves. Yes, that Keanu Reeves, but the bank manager had no idea who he was humiliating. "You think you're special because you're wearing designer clothes," scoffed Eric Coleman, the bank's uptight and condescending manager, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't Hollywood. If you don't have an account here, you're wasting my time." Keanu, who had walked into the bank with a modest demeanor, simply to inquire about a personal matter, was caught off guard by the hostility. He wasn't used to flaunting his fame or fortune, and had learned long ago that kindness was a currency far more valuable than wealth. He was wearing his favorite worn-out boots and a jacket he'd owned for over a decade, not exactly the image of a billionaire. What Eric Coleman didn't know, and was moments away from discovering, was that Keanu wasn't just a customer or a curious passerby. He was, in fact, the majority shareholder of the bank, a silent investor who had saved the institution from collapse during the 2008 financial crisis. The tension in the room reached its peak when a young woman, seated in the corner, whispered to her friend, "That's Keanu Reeves. He saved my sister's life in a car accident 2 years ago." The whisper, though soft, traveled like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened, but Eric Coleman was oblivious. "Look," Eric continued, his tone growing harsher, "I don't care who you are or what sob story you have. If you can't prove your worth, there's the door." Keanu didn't flinch. He smiled faintly, his eyes betraying a hint of sadness. "It's not about worth, Mr. Coleman," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that silenced the room. "Sometimes it's about how you treat people, especially when you think they can't do anything for you." As Eric was about to retort, the door to the bank swung open and a woman in her late 30s rushed in. Her name was Emily Carter, a single mother of 2 who worked as a teller at the bank. She froze the moment she saw Keanu, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Reeves?" she gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. You're the reason my boys have a home. You paid off our mortgage anonymously last Christmas." The room fell into a stunned silence. Eric's face turned pale as realization began to dawn. But before anyone could process what was happening, Keanu did something that no one expected. He walked over to Emily, gave her a warm hug, and whispered, "It's the least I could do." And that's when Eric Coleman's world began to crumble. The room felt heavy with silence as Eric Coleman stood frozen, his earlier arrogance now replaced with a growing sense of dread. Emily's words echoed in his mind, and the weight of her gratitude toward Keanu Reeves began to suffocate him. Keanu gently stepped back from Emily and glanced around the room, his calm demeanor masking the turmoil beneath. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. Disappointed in how power and status seemed to strip people of their humanity. But this wasn't about him. It was about setting things right. Eric, still grappling with the realization of who stood before him, stammered, I didn't realize, Mr. Reeves, I didn't mean." Keanu raised a hand, silencing him with a calm authority. "It's not about who I am, Mr. Coleman," he said softly. "It's about how you treat people when you think they're beneath you." His voice cracked slightly, hinting at an unspoken pain, something deeper. Emily's eyes darted between Keanu and the now humiliated manager. She had always admired Keanu, not just as a celebrity, but as a human being. She remembered the quiet dignity with which he'd paid off her mortgage, how he had never sought recognition. She couldn't understand why someone with so much could still carry an air of humility and grace. Just as Keanu was about to leave, a timid voice broke the silence. "Mr. Reeves?" A young boy, no older than 8, emerged from the line clutching a crumpled piece of paper. His mother, visibly embarrassed, tried to pull him back, but Keanu knelt down to his level, his eyes kind and patient. "Yes, buddy?" Keanu asked, his tone soft. The boy handed him the paper, a poorly drawn crayon sketch of a man with a long black coat and sunglasses. "Are you really John Wick?" he whispered, awe in his voice. A ripple of laughter and warmth spread through the bank, diffusing the tension. Keanu chuckled, his face lighting up. "I guess I am," he said, signing the drawing with a flourish. But as he handed it back, the boy's mother stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "You probably don't remember me," she said, her voice shaking. "But 5 years ago, you sat beside me at the bus station. I had just lost my husband and didn't know how to face the world. You talked to me for hours, and you gave me hope." Keanu stood, his expression softening as the memory surfaced. He reached out, holding her hands in his. "I remember," he said simply, "and I'm so glad you're here today." The entire room was captivated. Even Eric Coleman, who had spent years building walls around his emotions, felt a lump forming in his throat. He realized he wasn't just witnessing a celebrity moment, he was witnessing humanity at its finest. Keanu turned back to Eric, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Coleman, you have an incredible responsibility. People come here with their hopes, fears, and dreams. Don't let them leave with more weight than they came in with." Eric swallowed hard, unable to meet Keanu's gaze. Just then, a man in a sharp suit entered the bank, his steps confident yet unassuming. It was David Montgomery, the CEO of the bank, and the only person who knew the full extent of Keanu's involvement. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Keanu. "Ah, Mr. Reeves," David said with a warm smile. "I wasn't expecting you today." Keanu smiled back. "Neither was I," he replied. The atmosphere shifted as David approached Eric. "Mr. Coleman, I believe you've met our principal investor," he said, his voice laced with an edge. "The man who saved this institution when no one else would." Eric's knees nearly gave out. He stuttered an apology, but Keanu stopped him with a simple shake of his head. "There's no need for that," Keanu said. "Just remember this moment." As Keanu prepared to leave, Emily stopped him, her voice trembling. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "why do you do all this? You could just live your life, enjoy your success. Why go out of your way to help people?" Keanu paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling a memory too painful to share. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because once upon a time, someone helped me when I thought I couldn't go on, and I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd be that person for someone else." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling in, and with that, Keanu turned and walked out, leaving behind a bank full of people who would never see the world, or each other, the same way again. As Keanu stepped out into the brisk Los Angeles afternoon, the whispers and awe from the bank lingered behind him. He walked a few paces down the busy sidewalk, his mind clouded with memories he wished he could suppress. It wasn't just about helping people, it was about making amends for the times he couldn't. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, the name Claire flashed on the screen. She was the one person who always called when he least expected it. Her timing uncanny yet comforting. Claire Harper was his childhood friend, the one who had seen him at his best and his worst. After Keanu lost his beloved girlfriend Jennifer in a tragic accident decades ago, Claire had been his anchor. Though their lives had diverged, Claire now a teacher in a small Oregon town, they never truly let go of the bond they shared. "Keanu," her voice came through soft and familiar, like a melody from the past. "Are you okay?" He paused, leaning against a lamppost, the bustling city fading into background noise. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, though Claire knew better. "You're at it again, aren't you?" she asked, her tone a mix of amusement and concern. "At what?" he replied, though he already knew the answer. "Carrying the weight of the world," she said gently. "You can't save everyone, Keanu." He let out a quiet laugh, though it carried no joy. "I don't want to save everyone, Claire, just enough. Enough so the world doesn't feel so heavy for some." Claire sighed, and for a moment neither spoke. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind shared by two people who understood each other without needing words. "You know, sometimes you have to let people in too," she said after a while. "Not just strangers, people who care about you." Keanu didn't answer. He knew she was right, but he had spent so long being the giver, the helper, that he'd forgotten what it meant to receive. "Listen," Claire continued, her voice brightening. "I'm coming to LA next week for a conference. Let's have dinner, my treat." "Claire, you don't need to—" "It's not up for discussion," she interrupted, a hint of mischief in her tone. "And don't even think about paying the bill. I'll fight you for it." Keanu smiled, genuinely this time. "Fine. Dinner it is." As he hung up, he felt a flicker of warmth, a rare break in the storm of emotions that often consumed him. Claire had always been that for him, a reminder of simpler times, of a version of himself that wasn't weighed down by loss and regret. He started walking again, blending into the crowd when a voice called out behind him, "Mr. Reeves, wait!" Turning around, he saw Emily from the bank running toward him, clutching a small, tattered envelope. "I found this after you left," she said, slightly out of breath. "It must have fallen from your pocket." Keanu frowned, taking the envelope. He hadn't seen it in years. It was old, its edges worn, and his name was scrawled across it in a familiar handwriting, Jennifer's handwriting. He stared at it, his throat tightening. How had it ended up in his jacket? He thought he'd left it in a drawer, buried with the past he could never truly escape. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her eyes filled with concern. Keanu blinked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, thank you, Emily." She hesitated, sensing there was more to the envelope than he let on, but she didn't press. She simply nodded and walked away, leaving him alone with the ghost of a memory he wasn't ready to face. He stood there for a long time, the envelope heavy in his hands, before finally opening it. Inside was a single photograph of him and Jennifer, taken on the day they had planned their future together. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of hope. On the back she had written, "Don't forget to live, Keanu. Promise me you'll keep living even when it's hard." His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He folded the photo carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, clutching it tightly. For the first time in years, he let himself cry, not just for Jennifer, but for all the moments he'd kept bottled up. And as he wiped his tears, he felt something shift within him. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe it was time to let people in. Keanu stood there on the crowded sidewalk, the city buzzing around him like a distant hum. The photo and Jennifer's words were still clutched in his hand, their weight immeasurable. It was a piece of his past he hadn't dared confront for years, a reminder of a love so profound that even time had failed to dull its ache. As the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the streets, Keanu tucked the envelope back into his pocket. His mind was no longer on the bank, or Eric Coleman, or the people he had just left behind. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to Jennifer, to the life they had planned but never lived. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Claire. "Don't overthink everything. Just breathe. And don't ghost me on dinner next week." He smiled faintly, her familiar wit cutting through his melancholy. Claire had always been his rock, the one who knew when to push and when to let him be. But just as he was about to reply, a cab screeched to a halt nearby and a young woman stumbled out, her face streaked with tears. She couldn't have been more than 25, her hands trembling as she clutched a letter to her chest. Something about her reminded him of Jennifer. The same raw vulnerability, the same desperate hope in her eyes. Keanu hesitated, then stepped closer. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice breaking through her frantic movements. She looked up, startled, her tear-filled gaze meeting his. I don't know," she stammered, clutching the letter tighter. I got this, and now I don't know what to do." He gestured toward a nearby bench, and she hesitated before nodding. They sat down, the noise of the city fading as she unfolded the crumpled paper. "It's from my father," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't seen him in 10 years. He walked out on us when I was a kid, and now he wants to meet." Keanu listened intently, his heart aching for her. He could see the battle raging within her, the anger of abandonment warring with the yearning for closure. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. Her hands trembled as she wiped her eyes. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell him to stay out of my life, but another part wants to hear what he has to say." Keanu nodded, his own memories resurfacing. He thought of his father, of the strained relationship they'd shared, of the pain and reconciliation that had come far too late. "You have every right to be angry," he said finally. "But sometimes letting someone explain doesn't mean you're forgiving them. It just means you're giving yourself a chance to find peace." She looked at him, her expression shifting from despair to contemplation. "How do you know so much about this?" Keanu smiled faintly, the lines of his face softening. "Because I've been where you are, and I've learned that life is too short to carry the weight of what-ifs." For a moment they sat in silence, the letter clutched between her fingers. Finally she nodded, a small but determined spark in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I think I'll go." As she stood, she turned back to him, her brow furrowing as recognition dawned. "Wait, you're Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" He smiled again, his expression humble. "Sometimes," he said lightly, drawing a soft laugh from her. She left, her steps more confident than before, and Keanu sat alone on the bench, the weight in his chest slightly lighter. It wasn't much, but moments like this reminded him of why he tried to help others. But as the sun fully set, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, Keanu's thoughts turned back to Claire's text and the envelope in his pocket. Maybe it was time to stop running from the pieces of himself he'd tried to bury. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what could have been, not with sadness, but with gratitude for what Jennifer had taught him about love and resilience. And maybe, just maybe, Claire was right. It was time to stop carrying the world alone. Keanu walked through the streets of Los Angeles, the cool evening air brushing against his skin, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far more personal. The memories of Jennifer and the ghosts of the past had been pressing on him all day, but something had shifted in him. The encounter with the young woman, the one searching for answers from a father who had left her behind, had stirred something deep within him. It reminded him of the unfinished business he'd carried around for years. It had been too long since he'd allowed himself to really feel, not just for others, but for himself. Keanu had always been the one people turned to for help, for wisdom, for compassion, yet he had neglected the very thing that could heal him, letting others in, letting them help him heal. As he entered his apartment building, he saw the familiar flashing light on his phone. A new message from Claire. "Dinner's on, you better not cancel. I'll see you at 7. I miss you." Keanu smiled, his heart swelling. He had kept his distance for so long, afraid that his brokenness would pull her into his sorrow. But Claire never seemed to mind. She understood him in a way few people did, and that was why, despite all his reservations, he had agreed to dinner. He stared at the message for a moment before typing back, "I'm on my way. See you soon, Claire." The evening passed slowly, but in the best possible way. They talked, laughed, and reminisced about the years they had spent together before life pulled them in different directions. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a reunion of souls, the kind that transcended time and distance. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt at peace. The pieces of his heart once shattered were slowly starting to come together. As the evening drew to a close, Claire walked him to the door. Her hand lingered on his as she smiled up at him. "You know," she said softly, "I think you've been waiting for something, Keanu. Something to make you believe that life can be good again." He met her gaze, searching her eyes for a deeper meaning. "Maybe I've been waiting for someone to remind me of that," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. Claire's smile widened, and without another word, she kissed him. Gently, carefully, as if testing the waters of a connection that had always been there, quietly simmering beneath the surface. Keanu kissed her back, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt lighter. He felt seen. The next morning, Keanu woke up with a feeling he hadn't had in years. Hope. The kind of hope that made his heart beat just a little faster, that made the world seem a little brighter. He walked to the kitchen, the weight of the envelope with Jennifer's letter still in his pocket, but today it didn't feel heavy. Today he could finally breathe. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Claire standing there, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "I brought you coffee," she said with a smile, handing him a cup. Keanu smiled back, his heart full. "You always know just what I need." "I think we both do," she replied. They sat together, sipping their coffee in the soft morning light, talking about the future. Their future. It was a future that now seemed filled with possibilities, a future that didn't feel so daunting anymore. "I've been thinking," Keanu began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "about everything. Jennifer, my life, the choices I've made, and I realize now that I don't have to be perfect. I just need to keep going. I don't need to carry everything on my own." Claire reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You never have to carry it alone, Keanu. I'm here. We're here." And in that moment, Keanu realized something that had eluded him for years. Love wasn't about fixing everything. It was about being present for each other, about sharing the burden and the joy. As they sat there, together, the past no longer felt like a chain holding him back. It felt like a part of his journey, one that had led him to this very moment. And for the first time in years, Keanu was ready to step forward, not alone, but with someone who truly understood him. It wasn't the end of his story, it was just the beginning. A new chapter, one filled with love, with healing, and with the promise of a future brighter than anything he had ever imagined.